Hello and welcome to the second episode of Risk REconsidered, a new podcast series from Swiss Re that explores the challenges and opportunities of mitigating climate risk. I'm your host, Sherry Elliker.
When you have hurricanes over warmer ocean water, their odds of undergoing intensification do go up.
It's been an active hurricane season with 17 named storms, including 4 major hurricanes as of November 5th. Beryl in June and July became the earliest Category 5 storm. And of course, communities in Florida, but also the Carolinas, will be rebuilding, in some cases for years, after Hurricanes Helene and Milton.
We have to change our mindset to understand the risk of where we live.
If you try to work against Mother Nature, you're going to lose every single time.
With me today is Matt Young, who, as head of Swiss Re's property underwriting in the United States, has been busy assessing the fallout from these storms and what it means for the reinsurance industry. And Phil Klotzbach, who, as a senior research scientist at Colorado State University's Department of Atmospheric Science, creates hurricane season forecasts that are must-reading for insurers, disaster relief officials, and global media. This year, CSU's forecast called for a very active season. Later in the episode, we'll also hear from Sid Kitson, an American real estate developer, about his Babcock Ranch property, a Florida community that is being built to the highest building codes, with the aim of making its structures resistant to hurricanes. It's gotten a lot of attention after making it through Hurricane Ian in 2022, and now Hurricane Milton, virtually unscathed. But for now, welcome Phil and Matt.
Nice to be here.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
Great. Well, Phil, your team at CSU forecasts an extremely active hurricane season. Did you get it right?
That's a great question. Overall, we did correctly anticipate an above normal season. As of today, November 5th, we have had a total, as you mentioned, 17 storms. Of those 17, 10 have become hurricanes, and of those 10, 4 major Category 3, 4, 5 hurricanes. These are storms with winds of 111 miles per hour or greater. The reason we separate those out is while they only make up about a quarter of the storms that occur in an average season, they do about 80 to 85% of the damage. As you already alluded to, Hurricanes Helene and Milton, both major hurricanes, and obviously even major hurricanes when they made landfall. So for the number of storms, our forecast is likely to be somewhat of an over forecast. We forecast 23 storms. Right now we're sitting at 17. It's early November. Maybe we'll get 1 or 2 more, but that's likely to be a little bit of an over forecast. But the number of hurricanes and major hurricanes is going to be pretty close. When you add up all those hurricane landfalls together, we're likely looking at $100 billion or more in U.S. damage. So a very damaging year as well.
Matt, what role do hurricane forecasts like those from CSU play in helping reinsurers plan for the upcoming season?
So as reinsurers, we are hungry for data, and we use as much data and tools as we can to predict what's going to happen in the property insurance world. So we use those forecasts to supplement our underwriting and risk management. As a reinsurer, where this is my full-time job, I would argue that they're nice to have information. They don't necessarily fuel a great degree of action for my team, for a professional reinsurer. The thing is that many reinsurers are backed by capital markets in some way, and that's where these forecasts play a much larger role. So capital markets can be much more volatile, and investors in catastrophe risk will rely on these forecasts to decide where they direct their assets. Maybe they want to send it to another investment class or deploy more or less capital to catastrophe risk. That I've noticed more this year than in prior years. So they certainly do have an impact on the insurance market.
Phil, scientists at World Weather Attribution concluded that climate change intensified Hurricane Milton. Can you break this down for us?
Well, let's see. Do you want to spend the next hour on this question? When it comes to climate change and hurricanes, there's a ton of different things that we can look at. So a lot of times when people say, are hurricanes getting worse? A lot of it is emphasized on the damage. And certainly from a damage perspective, yes, hurricanes are causing more damage. Most of that simply due to more people and more stuff, in insurance parlance, more exposure along the coastline. As you alluded to at the start, there are really cool improvements in building codes and really neat technology that's there to really help mitigate some of these, but generally as you put more people and more stuff in harm's way, the damage is going to go up. So that is regardless of anything with climate change. Now with climate change, as you have a storm like Hurricane Milton, Hurricane Helene, when you have hurricanes over warmer ocean water, their odds of undergoing intensification do go up. Now with climate change, it's a messy signal because you warm the ocean surface with climate change, but you also warm throughout the atmosphere, say 20 to 30,000 feet. Higher up in the atmosphere, you warm even more. And that tends to stabilize the atmosphere. And that can take some of the edge off the ocean warming. Also, there are other critical factors that we need to get a hurricane to undergo rapid intensification, like we saw with storms like Helene and Milton. One of the biggest ones is lower levels of vertical wind shear. If you have too much wind shear, which is a change in wind speed and direction with height, that will tend to tear apart hurricanes. And we saw that with Milton in the last 24 hours as it was coming on shore. It was a monster Category 5 hurricane, and it did weaken quite a bit to a Category 3 by the time it made landfall. In addition to impacts from, say, slightly stronger storms in the future, we also know with climate change that we have sea level rise. And while sea level rise, to me, living in Colorado, doesn't seem like much of a deal, living at 5,000 feet, when you deal with 6 inches of sea level rise, a foot of sea level rise can make a big difference in how far that water penetrates inland. Increased inundation can cause big increases in losses from storms. Also, as we've seen in recent years, when you have a warmer atmosphere, that can hold more moisture. And we see heavier rainfall from hurricanes and just heavier rainfall from summertime thunderstorms. So that is another factor that would likely increase the damage. Again, when it comes to storm intensity, likely storms in the future will be a little bit stronger. And also, obviously, the biggest driver of the increase in damage in recent years still just being the growth in population along the coast.
Matt, you've studied the drivers of hurricane losses, including from Hurricane Ian in 2022. Is storm behavior related to climate change driving costlier hurricanes, or are there different factors at play?
I think Phil did a really nice job of explaining the scientific aspect of how climate change impacts hurricanes. He also alluded to the other drivers. So I say with absolute certainty, yes, there are other drivers at play that are increasing losses. I think the risk that we have in attributing increasing losses solely to climate change is that we miss this opportunity to address potentially larger drivers like increasing population on the coast that insurance companies have to deal with today. Sometimes we look at climate change and say, well, that's a big problem. I can't solve that myself, or my company can't solve that ourselves. But certainly insurance companies can and have to address accumulation that comes with more people moving towards the coast. So to put some numbers to that, since the 1970s, Florida's population has tripled, which has driven a modeled annual expected loss increase of more than 180%. Florida has excellent building codes, and they greatly mitigate the loss of life and property damage. But more people in harm's way will inevitably lead to larger losses. Phil's already said that. The benefits that Florida has seen from those strengthened building codes have been totally overwhelmed by the population growth. And while my comments and stats are focused only on Florida, this trend continues, whether it's coastal Florida or Texas or the Northeast. So climate change is certainly one part of it, but there are also other factors at play, like population trends and urbanization, that have potentially a much greater impact on it.
So, Matt, Milton could have been worse had it not shifted away from Tampa Bay, but it seems like states that have seen significant population growth in recent decades are also the same states vulnerable to hurricanes?
Yeah, so of course, Florida is beautiful. I live in the Chicago area. Phil lives in Colorado. After you've experienced a lifetime of winters, the idea of warmth and sun has great appeal. So I don't think it's realistic to dissuade people from living in beautiful places, whether it's California or Florida or coastal Carolinas. But we have to have this idea of adapting and mitigating. We have to change our mindset to understand the risk of where we live. Now, whether that's on a small scale, like our house, a single property, or on a much larger scale, like city adaptation or across an entire state. But I think that is absolutely critical.
So, Matt, does this mean places that have seen less population growth are off the hook?
Of course not. One of the factors that we haven't talked about yet is the impact of inflation. So while population growth and urbanization lead to an accumulation risk that we've seen have tremendous impact on uninsured and insured loss, increasing costs just in general are also challenging both for property owners and for insurers.
Now, Phil, we heard a great deal about the roughly 35 tornadoes that hit during Milton. Tornadoes can occur during these events, but was there anything that struck you about these ones? Were they more intense than the past or more numerous?
Yeah, so you're right. Milton was quite the prolific tornado producer. And while other hurricanes have produced more tornadoes than Milton, Hurricane Ivan in 2004 produced over 100. What was notable about Milton's tornadoes, I think, was their intensity. And the most notable was an EF3 that touched down in northern St. Lucie County that killed 6 people. Well, hurricanes often spawn tornadoes. Really, the same strong upper level winds that basically sheared Milton as it was coming on shore and weakened it substantially. Also, that same shear that's detrimental for hurricanes is beneficial for tornado formation.
Matt, hurricanes have characteristics that impact insurers in different ways. Can you break down some of these distinctions and maybe apply this to 2024 storms?
So every storm is unique and we're constantly learning, and that's why I love my job. Some of the factors that can impact insured losses. The physical attributes of the storm, there's several of them. So where the storm makes landfall has a great impact. Hurricanes are huge weather systems, but it's possible that the relatively small area near the eye of the storm sees the worst damage. And so the accumulation risk in urban areas is a significant concern for our industry. If Milton would have made landfall slightly further north in the Tampa area, it could have been a very different storm. Wind strength is an obvious factor. So building codes have greatly mitigated loss from lower strength hurricanes, but our infrastructure is still vulnerable, along with older properties. And then flooding. So we've talked about intense rainfall. So when we think of flooding, we often think of storm surge, and that can be devastating, absolutely. But intense rainfall associated with several of our recent storms continues to drive significant losses. Now, much of that goes uninsured. That gets to another piece. How do they impact insurance companies? Or maybe how does it not impact insurers, is insurance penetration. So the US has the largest insurance protection gap globally, and much of this is driven by wind and flood. Now, when we think protection gap, we often think of underserved insurance markets, maybe developing nations, but the reality is the values that we have at risk here in the US drive the largest insurance gap. The way that we've defined risk historically, it's often been, well, it's never happened to me. And so we dismiss insurance as an unnecessary expense. Or we say, well, you're in a 1 in 100 year flood zone, and that means you have a 1% annual probability of having a loss. And the typical homeowner or property owner says, that's a really low risk. That's not going to happen to me. When in reality, that's how we define what high risk is. So we kind of have to change our thinking of how we're communicating risk. But flooding is particularly problematic, as evidenced by Hurricane Helene, where in the impacted areas, there was less than a 1% insurance take-up rate. And many homeowners don't even realize that their typical homeowner's policy doesn't cover flood. So I think Hurricane Helene illustrates just how devastating this idea of flood risk and the flood protection gap can be in the United States.
So, Phil, after analyzing storms like Helene and Milton, are there new insights that could change the way forecasters approach future seasons?
Yeah, the 2024 season was a really, really strange one in that overall we ended up with an above normal season, but we got at it in a really unusual way in that we started out with Hurricane Beryl, earliest Category 5 on record, and we had 3 hurricanes through mid-August, which is really busy, and then we had this really pronounced lull, and I did so many interviews about the lull, and everyone's saying, oh, the season's a dud, nothing's going to happen, blah, 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 and around September 15th, you could see the models were going bananas, and a lot of storms were about to happen, and so I think it's important to realize that when we talk about the hurricane season, that no 2 hurricane seasons, like no 2 hurricanes, are alike. So this season was an extremely backloaded season in that we had a lot of hurricanes, a lot of storms at the end. And while we had 3 hurricane landfalls in the US before Helene and Milton, obviously those were by far the most impactful storms of the season. And I think when it comes to those 2 storms, really it does highlight that every hurricane by definition is going to have a wind threat, but some have more of a storm surge threat, some are more of a rainfall threat. We think about Helene, where it made landfall was a very sparsely populated part of the coast in Florida, but because we had basically what they call a pre-event, so prior to Helene, we had basically a stalled front over the Appalachian Mountains, which combined with all that warm Gulf moisture, basically caused a tremendous amount of rainfall in North Carolina prior to when Helene actually got there. So basically, the rain from Helene was kind of the straw that broke the proverbial camel's back and really really caused the epic flooding that we saw. Kind of highlighting how, again, each of these storms is different. And I think really from a public perception, we need to focus on the entire season and not let people get carried away for a trend for 1 or 2 weeks or even a month. The season does go from June to November. And I think that's kind of one of the things that we need to realize when we're doing these seasonal forecasts or even shorter term forecasts is to not get too carried away if things look really, really busy or really quiet for, say, a shorter period of time.
Matt, post Helene and Milton, some communities may take years to recover. What are the lessons we can take away from 2024's storms?
Sure. I mean, the first one is just because it hasn't happened to me doesn't mean it won't. Back to that risk perception. Frequency of storms in the same area can lead to problems. Phil just referenced that, and I think that could be one of the biggest takeaways of this year. Also, things like the urgency in debris pickup was a topic after Helene, before Milton. That's usually not what we think about when we're talking about preparing for hurricanes, that there's debris from a prior hurricane. Back to the risk insight, we just have to be better as an industry at sharing our risk insights. So we can no longer rely on simple maps to define flood risk. We can't think of 1 in 100 year as, well, that's just not going to happen to me. And we've got to take every opportunity to encourage risk mitigation.
So, Phil, after storms like those of the 2024 season come up, questions like the insurability of assets inevitably emerge. What's your view?
If you're in the business of insurance, you're in the risk game. So obviously every property has a risk associated with it. So you can calculate what that risk is. One of the things that we have seen, though, is we've seen a lot of property insurance companies moving out of coastal states because of the risks that are there. But one of the cool things that we have seen is as states and communities adopt stricter building codes, the insurance companies are starting to come back. And I think probably one of the biggest success stories we're seeing is in Alabama, where they have this fortified roof program. And I believe 50 of the 60,000 roofs that have been put on, I believe, are in Alabama. But it's pretty amazing because you have all these really well-built houses. Having that roof structure is critical. If the roof fails, everything else fails. So by keeping that on, that has really mitigated the damage. And insurance companies, their appetite is increased for properties like that because they think the risk is a lot lower.
Speaking of affected communities, I spoke to Sid Kitson, a Florida developer who has for more than a decade been the driving force behind the Babcock Ranch community. His community, northwest of Fort Myers, survived Hurricane Ian in 2022 and Milton last month virtually unscathed. Mr. Kitson, thanks so much for speaking with us. You stayed at Babcock Ranch during Milton. I would have been terrified.
Well, I tell you, these hurricanes are all so different. It's amazing. Back when Hurricane Ian came through, it was a different kind of storm than Milton. When Ian came across Cuba, if you recall, and then hit those Gulf waters, it just exploded into the strong Category 4 hurricane and then made a beeline right for Babcock Ranch. And what was amazing about that was we're on the eastern side, which is what they call the dirty side of the eye of the storm. And it sat on top of us for 8 hours. It was going about 3 miles an hour. And at the time at Babcock Ranch, I had about 5,000 people living here, 5,000 neighbors. And I told all of them that they could shelter at home. But when you've got 100-mile-an-hour sustained winds and 150-mile-an-hour gusts, oh my gosh, it was just this incredible feeling. All the preparation, all the work that we had done for years to get ready for this very moment. You just don't really know, is it really going to work? And I can remember that next morning when the sun came up and that storm had finally moved out, and I went around Babcock Ranch and probably spent about 5 hours driving neighborhoods and meeting with people. And we had virtually no damage at all. And it was really remarkable. Then fast forward here 2 years later to Milton, and what made that different was we had probably 90-mile-an-hour winds, and it was moving very fast. The storm really hit very, very quickly, and it was not a direct hit to us, but there were tornadoes everywhere. And that's a whole different feeling when all of a sudden now you have the severity of those types of storms, but very, very different from Ian. But it was the same kind of thing. We had 90-mile-an-hour winds, went through fairly quickly, but went through the night. Next morning, drove the community. And again, almost no damage at all. The key here for most people who live there, we didn't lose any power, didn't lose any water service. And I think for people going through something like that, it makes a huge difference when you can still have the lights on.
Absolutely. That's highly significant. Some people took shelter at Babcock Ranch. How did you accommodate everybody?
This is something we're very, very proud of. We built a 40,000 square foot shelter, a Category 5 shelter. It's what they call an ICC 500 rated facility. And you hope you never have to use these, but with 40,000 square feet, we're able to accommodate about 1,300 people in that facility. But they evacuated the entire coastline in Charlotte County and Lee County of Florida. So these evacuees had to go somewhere. We ended up with over 2,000 people in the shelter and our schools at Babcock Ranch. We told the people that live in Babcock, you can shelter at home. Now we have over 10,000 people living here. And they had probably another 1,000 to 2,000 people coming from those areas staying in their homes at Babcock Ranch. And so we had probably anywhere from 3,000 to 4,000 people from those evacuated areas staying at Babcock Ranch. And as I said, once again, we didn't lose power and we didn't flood. We'll talk about that in a minute. But it really was very special the way that the people of Babcock Ranch, the people who live here, really opened up their homes and their hearts to lend a helping hand to all those people who really needed it.
So, Mr. Kitson, how do you build a hurricane-resistant city?
We originally bought 91,000 acres. That's an area 5 times the size of the island of Manhattan, or 143 square miles. But the intention was always to preserve as much as possible. So we actually sold 73,000 acres back to the state of Florida in the largest land purchase in the history of the state. So what we did was we started with a blank sheet of paper. And by the way, it's 30 feet above sea level. That was very intentional. We wanted to build a new city in a place that was well above the storm surge. And Babcock Ranch is going to have over 20,000 homes and 6 million square feet of commercial space. But again, we had this blank sheet of paper. We wanted to prove that a new town and the environment can live hand in hand. And we wanted to do that and be the most sustainable, the most resilient and most innovative new town. And again, we could do it right from the beginning. So we went back and looked at maps from the 1940s to find out where the natural flowways are. We identified those flowways and said, we're going to stay out of those. We're not going to build on them. We wanted to work with Mother Nature and not against Mother Nature. I can assure you, if you try to work against Mother Nature, you're going to lose every single time. So we stayed out of these flowways. And then we said, okay, let's preserve as many of the wetlands as we possibly can. Wetlands are beautiful. They're great habitats, but they also store a tremendous amount of water. And then we have a smart water management system that can predict the weather 10 days in advance and lower the lakes in anticipation of having more rain. In fact, when Ian hit, we had at least another 20 inches of capacity available. And that's after it had rained the entire week before that. We require native plant materials in Babcock Ranch. And everybody asks me, why do you do that? Well, because they're good in the wind, they're good in dry weather, and they're good in wet weather. So it just made sense in these high winds to have materials that would be able to survive that. And then we put all of our utilities underground. Everything is underground and hardened. And we own and operate the water and wastewater plant. And we made certain that that was well above any type of flooding or storm surge and was hardened. But I think the partnership we have with Florida Power and Light was one of the keys. We are the first solar-powered town in America. We have 700,000 panels on 840 acres that powers Babcock Ranch. It's 150 megawatts. But more importantly, all the power lines coming into Babcock Ranch were also hardened. So in order for the power to go out of Babcock Ranch, certainly tornadic activity can be a problem, but it is extremely resilient, hardened, and we were very, very well prepared when that hurricane ultimately hit. And by the way, not one of those panels was dislodged during a strong Category 4 hurricane. Again, very well built and very resilient to these types of storms.
You mentioned the solar panels, and the community is largely powered by that. Is the energy installation vulnerable at all?
You know, everything is vulnerable. You can do everything you possibly want, and at the end of the day, Mother Nature certainly is going to win out. But we have now been through 3 very significant hurricanes, and we have not lost one panel. So I think that what that proves is there's great reliability.
How does Babcock Ranch fit into the discussions about insurability?
Boy, that's such a great question. When you're building a new city or you're building something like a Babcock Ranch, I guess good behavior is rewarded. But we also recognize that it needs to happen in more than one place. This resiliency, the hardening of the infrastructure, they're preparing for these types of storms, getting the right building codes, really thinking through what needs to be done to truly be resilient needs to be not just in one place, but be done all over. One thing I'll say about the state of Florida is they have done a fantastic job with the building codes. And after Hurricane Andrew and that devastation, they changed them and they work. You can tell after these storms pass through what's a newer home and what is a home from pre-1992. So I think that if we continue down this path, doing a really good job of thinking about how we're going to perform, how places are going to react to these storms that are coming through now, I think you'll see then these insurance rates start to come down. We've had some really good conversations with a number of insurance companies, and it's very encouraging. And I think that they want to see us survive and do a good job with these initiatives that we've put into place. And I do believe that as time goes on, that more of these types of communities are going to come up and be more resilient. And I think in turn, these insurance costs are going to come down.
Is your phone now ringing off the hook from people who want to move to your community?
They are. And from all over America and internationally. We've had some great coverage, not only throughout the United States, but really from around the world. And as I tell people who call me and say, hey, we want to do what you're doing, and do you mind if we kind of use your playbook? I say, absolutely, go right ahead. And I hope they do an even better job than we're doing. That would be the ultimate compliment.
Mr. Kitson, thank you so much. I really appreciate your time. So Matt and Phil, what an interesting project where people are resorting to adaptation measures to shield themselves from natural catastrophes. Another question people seem to be asking themselves as some of these weather-related hazards intensify is, do I need to move somewhere else? Get out of harm's way?
I think it's important to realize that no place is completely safe from weather or climate threats. For example, where I live in Colorado, try my best to mitigate the risks, but where we live in Colorado has a pretty significant hail risk. That's probably the biggest risk where I live, but also you have tornado threat. There was a tornado that came within a half mile of our house a couple of years ago and caused a lot of roof damage. But really the key is knowing what your risks are, and there's so many great tools online now to be able to know your flood risk, know your tornado risk, your hurricane risk, all these different things. So I think it's really important to understand the risks.
Okay, Phil, I'm going to put you on the spot here a little bit. Can you give us a glimpse into your crystal ball yet? What is the 2025 hurricane season shaping up to be like?
We'll put out our first forecast in early April, but one of the big questions that we address every year is, are we going to have El Nino or not? And El Nino is warmer than normal waters in the central and eastern tropical Pacific. When that occurs, it tends to increase levels of what's known as vertical wind shear. Again, that's that change in wind speed and direction with height. Too much shear tears apart hurricanes. So normally when we have El Nino, that tends to reduce your storm activity and especially reduce your major hurricane activity. We had El Nino last year, and it was still actually an above normal season due to the fact the Atlantic was so dang hot that it dominated over the El Nino signal. This year, we did not have El Nino. We're trending more towards La Nina, which is colder water in the eastern and central tropical Pacific. That tends to create conditions that are more conducive for hurricanes. So one of the big questions is, are we going to go back to El Nino? That would be pretty unusual given we haven't even really gotten to La Nina yet. So I'd say the odds of El Nino for next year are pretty low. Normally, if we don't have El Nino, that tends to increase the odds of a busy season. One of the other big questions is the Atlantic has been extremely warm since about March of 2023, much, much warmer than normal. And that continues into November of 2024. How will that change? Often over the course of the winter, if you're going to see a big shift in the Atlantic water temperatures from above normal to near normal or vice versa, it happens during the winter. So we'll just kind of have to watch and see how that plays out. All seasons since 2015 have been above normal or hyperactive, except for 2022, which was classified as a near normal season. But obviously even 2022 had Hurricane Ian, so certainly not a near normal season from a damage perspective.
Matt, how about for insurers and reinsurers? What impacts do you anticipate the 2024 season will have on the reinsurance landscape next year?
Well, we will be eagerly awaiting CSU's forecast. I think the impact on the insurance and reinsurance space, proper accumulation management will again be highlighted, and a conversation on what is the normal frequency of these larger hurricanes needs to be considered. Ultimately, though, the state of the insurance market, it will remain strong, and reinsurers' value proposition will be demonstrated as a shock absorber for these large events. And I think that will be one of the takeaways from 2024.
Phil and Matt, thank you so much for joining us. Fascinating conversation.
Thanks, Sherry.
Yeah, thank you very much.
For more on how Swiss Re can support you on the issues raised in this episode, as well as other issues facing the insurance industry, visit swissre.com/podcasts.